I am so happy to have with me today Neely Khan, who is I think you call yourself a storyteller, but you're also a travel writer and a hospitality writer. Neely, thank you so much for joining me. We met in Miami at the Book Direct show, and I've been wanting to get you on the show ever since then. So here we are.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. I'm so honored to be here. I've been listening to your podcast, ironically, since Miami, and I'm a big, big fan. So the pleasure is definitely all mine.
Well, thank you very much, and we're going to come on actually a little later in this podcast to talk about a slightly different podcast that you've been producing along with John and Matteo. We'll cover that off a bit later on, but we're going to kick off. I want to kick off by asking you. I said you're a storyteller. What's your story? How did you get into this business and in the role that you're currently in?
That's a great question. Great question. So I will start from the very beginning because I definitely, as you've explained, I definitely see myself as a story person. I think I first realized the power of stories when I was very, very young, about 7 or 8 years old, and I used to really struggle with math and anything to do with numbers at school. So physics, anything that involved equations and things like that. And because of that, I was brought up in a very academic environment. So because of that, I would always get in trouble with my parents, my dad in particular. So one day, we were learning some kind of equations in school in my math class. And as a way of helping me remember the equation that my teacher was repeatedly trying to teach me, I thought of a story to help me remember that particular equation. And lo and behold, after that, I understood what he was trying to explain to me for months straight away. And I realized after that moment that, I mean, I was so young at the time, but even at that time, I realized in that moment that when you wrap a story around something, anything, it immediately becomes more interesting and perhaps more importantly, more memorable. And then as I journeyed through my sort of academic years, every time I had trouble understanding anything in school, I would write poems, I would write stories. I think I was the first student in our school who had a creative poem displayed on the wall of a math classroom. And I remember my math teacher saying to my dad on parents' evening that your daughter is a very good storyteller. So it definitely started from there. Storytelling for me was very much a way of helping me understand the world, in a way that, related to me. So I did very well in school, again, because of my academic upbringing. I always knew that I wanted to be a writer. I was always an avid reader, very stereotypical writerish behavior, and I loved poetry. That's the first piece of writing I actually started off with poems. So during my academic studies, I moved to Cambridge to study further. I studied English literature, of course. And then while I was at university, I started working in hospitality. And what I found was that exercised a different part of my personality. I think oftentimes people believe that writers are very introverted, but whether you're introverted or extroverted or ambiverted, you are genuinely fascinated by people. And I think this is a commonality among all writers, all storytellers. So I really enjoyed the work I was doing in hospitality. I continued where I started off with basic front of house and I moved up to, training and recruitment. After I graduated, I very shortly after that became a single parent. I was very, very young at the time. And it was around the time when I became a single parent that I was only about 22. I realized that I needed to actually pursue what I wanted to do, pursue my passion and not victimize myself as a single parent. So even though I had a good full-time job in hospitality at the time, I left that job to write stories for a living instead. I do not recommend this method to anyone because I had no plan, I had no business experience, I had no money, I had a 3-year-old, and I just started writing. And I started off by writing about myself and my own story, being a parent, being a writer, being a storyteller. And that got me my first bit of business. I decided to niche into hospitality because of my passion in hospitality anyway, and then I further niched into the short term rental industry after having met Chris Morn completely. It was a complete serendipity. So Chris Morn of IPRAC and AES Events and Accommodation, he was my first client in the industry. After that, Chris invited me to Damien Sheridan's very first book direct show in London, which was about 3.5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. And I think that's it very much took off from there. So the journey started off at a very, very young age, but here we are now. And that's the
So
story so far.
what's a day in the life of Neely Khan look like then?
Oh, I love that. I don't think so. I'm definitely a mix between a very good, comfortable blend between I love routine and familiarity. I'm a Taurus, so it's very much ingrained into my soul. So I always start my mornings off doing exactly the same thing. I go to exactly the same place every single morning, have exactly the same drink. I have a cortado in the morning, and I spend the first hour of my day after I've dropped my daughter to school to just do something I enjoy. So that might be some journaling, that might be some reading, that might be working on a project that I'm particularly, excited about. So I will always do that. That is a given. That's my Neely time in the morning. That gets me into the right mindset. Being with my daughter and having sort of the mummy duties, I tend to have about 5 solid hours every day before it's time to collect Sophia again from school. So during those 5 hours, I do all the writing that I need to do. Ironically, being a writer and a storyteller doesn't actually involve that much writing. It involves more reading, more researching, more visiting places, more talking to people. So after that very routinely morning with my coffee, it very much depends on the projects that I'm working on and what I feel like doing. I like to have a little bit of fluidity, so I take the day as it comes. Yeah.
You can certainly tell from talking to you that you're a storyteller. It's I'm drawn in to listening to your story. So this is what we're going to talk about now, because we hear all the time about brand storytelling. This is something that everybody has to do. You have to tell the story of your brand, and I've heard from people say, I don't understand this. What does this actually mean? Do I have to go out and find a fictional story about? Because I know if you go into, if you, and I'm sure we'll discuss this, if you go to Chat GPT and you say, tell me a story, it's going to, there was a lady called Susan, and she was in short-term rentals, and it will come up with a relatively bland and generic style
Mhm.
story. So that's one way of doing of looking at storytelling. Can you give me some sort of flavor of what storytelling actually is within this business, in from the perspective of a host or a manager of a small company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the answer would actually be relevant across the board, across various industries. From a business and commercial point of view, when people speak about brand storytelling, and you're absolutely correct, it has become a bit of a buzzword, a buzz phrase. For me, layman terms definition is using the power of narratives to drive an emotional reaction from your audience, and then get them to take action, whatever desired action that it is that you want them to take. So however you choose to articulate that story, whether that be through writing, whether that be through video, whether that be through audio, the idea primarily is always to trigger some kind of emotion. And obviously, this plays very well into emotional marketing. And this is why storytelling is so important. Not because there's a beginning, middle, and an end, not because there's a conflict, not because there's a villain. Obviously, these are all elements that make stories and are extremely, extremely important. But ultimately, stories trigger emotions, and we all make decisions based on emotions, no matter how pragmatic we might claim to be, but that is how, it's wired into our DNA. So that would be
So
my definition of it.
okay, so let's look at let's say a manager of a small company, and they've got 30 or 40 properties. I'm thinking about those because these are the people we're going to be talking to at scale. Well, I'm going to be talking to at Scale Rentals. Are you talking at Scale Rentals or the Book Direct show?
I'm speaking at the Book Direct show. Yeah.
Right, right. But
Exciting.
still, there'll be these types of people around about 30, 40 properties.
Hmm.
Can you give me example of some of the type of story that this person could tell in their marketing?
Absolutely. So within our industry, the easiest way to look at it is compartmentalize storytelling within our industry into business, corporate storytelling, and personal storytelling. So, personal storytelling, which is the kind of storytelling that I think most people in our industry are most familiar with, is when you use your own story, your own personal story, and your own journey, and use that to engage your audience, to build a relationship with your audience, to build trust with your audience, and then leverage that for your business. So, if you are a property host, property manager, you could speak about your own journey of how you got started in the industry. You know, if you do that well enough, your audience will warm to you and therefore feel drawn to your brand and feel that by then spending money with your brand, by booking with one of your properties, they are connecting with you. So that's how you would use, in very, very layman's terms, personal storytelling. The other side of it, corporate storytelling, which I think we definitely could do with more of in our industry, which I don't see as much of in our space, is when you place your guests at the heart of the stories that you're telling. And this is actually probably more of what I do in the services that I offer. So you make the guest the hero of your story, and you yourself step in as the guide. As you know, if you've read Storybrand by Donald Miller, then I'm sure you'll be aware of this concept. So every story you tell is about your guests. Doesn't even have to be problems, about their desires, their needs, their aspirations, and how the service that you're offering, so your property, or even better, the vacation, the experience that you're offering, helps that guest reach their desired outcome. And you make it all about the guest. And there are lots of different ways that you can do this. I mean, even across your website, you can use story-led content to do this, across your social media posts, but it is very much about placing the guest at the heart of all the stories that you write and that you tell. So those are the two ways that I would sort of split it up and look at it. And they're two very different ways of
Mhm.
doing it, both equally important, I think.
I've talked a lot on the podcast about the About Us page, and it's interesting whenever I look at a website, um, when I'm looking for a product or a service, I go directly to the About Us
Yeah.
or About Us page to find out, who are the people behind this. So often you find the generic, our company does this, and it's not a story. I'd like to start with that, really. So if you were advising somebody on how to do their About Us page, what would you be telling them?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I think the about, if I'm not wrong, the about page is the most visited page after the
Mhm.
homepage, when it comes to just your regular sort of guest booking journey. And obviously, I think the trap, the big confusion here is that, well, if it's called the About Us page and we're talking about us, then it's quite difficult to not make it all about us. And the best bit of advice that I think I've heard about copy generally on websites is don't we all over your website. You want to use the word you far more than you want to use the word we and our. So I love the idea of an about us page, because people who are booking with you generally do want to know more about you. That is important. Again, it's very important for building trust. I would personally, I feel like it's like a mindset shift, and it's about just sort of changing the way you look at it. Maybe instead of having, I mean, you don't need to call it your about us page. I mean, there is such a thing as being too smart and too creative. But if somebody took their, if a property host took their About Us page and maybe reframed it as their story page, you can still tell a story about yourself and still make it very, very relevant and interesting to the person who is reading it. So, for example, if I'm telling you a story that I tell very often about me being a single parent and being a single mom. So I'm telling a story about myself. However, while I'm telling that story, I may be telling another group of women about it and saying things like, so when I became a single parent, I didn't know how I would balance my work life with my personal life and my responsibilities as a mother. And as I'm sure you can understand, because I'm sure many of you can relate to this, can you imagine having a really important meeting and then having a call from school saying that your daughter needs to be taken home? So it's about using phrases like that. I'm sure you can imagine, or
Mhm.
inviting your guest, and in the so if it's a host telling their story, inviting the person who is reading that story to imagine themselves in their shoes. So there is a way of telling your own story but still making it very relevant to your guests as well. So I think that is more difficult to do. So I would definitely say, oftentimes it helps to have somebody to help with that process. But I think that is the best way to do it, because if you're simply only talking about yourself and how many awards you've won and how you got shortlisted for X, Y, and Z, these are great achievements, don't get me wrong, and you should be proud of them. But at the end of the day, I think the most important question to ask yourself when you're creating copy for that page in particular is, do my guests care, and how is this relevant to them? And just be quite ruthless with that, because ultimately, again, your guests and the people who are visiting your website are the most important people. So
One of my favorite ones is from uh, a site called Seahorse Diamond Beach, and it's
mhm,
in Australia. It's a lady called Diane Denton. I don't know if you've ever come across Diane. She's an amazing person, and she invites people with horses, to come and stay at her property.
love
So
that.
she has a stable for their horses,
Yeah.
and she knows from her personal experience, and this is in her about us section, that people with horses love the idea of riding their horses along a beach.
Mm,
And she tells a story about her horse and how magic it is to ride that horse along the beach. And she wanted to create a place where people just like her could come and bring their horses. Now that to me is just that perfect blend of, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, and this is how I'm going to impact you
wow.
by that.
I love that. I love that. And again, so she told her story, but she's inviting other people like her to imagine themselves in her shoes. And that's a great example. In storytelling, we call it transportation, when you describe something or an event and you invite your audience to
Hmm.
imagine themselves in that, doing the same thing in that scenario. So it's very, very powerful. I can see why that works so well for her.
Yes, yeah, so sort of like a come along on this journey with me.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
So
Sounds.
I said, as Diane does it, she's looking, her avatar, her persona is people like her,
Mm,
somebody with with animals, and she also she accepts dogs of any
mhm.
type, so pet owners of any sort. Um, so that's her avatar, is somebody like her. How important is it to have this avatar, this persona, target market, target person, whoever you want to call it? How important is it to have that before you start your story?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's like the golden rule, isn't it? I think any sort of marketing, branding sort of course or whatever you sign up for, it's one of the first things that you will be taught is to identify your guest avatar. Not only just to identify them, but know them inside out. It is the most important thing. I mean, anything I write, you have to know who you're writing for. Otherwise, you are literally shooting in the dark. And it's not even just about that. It's, if you're articulating your story with writing, for example, it's about learning what kind of language they use, what kind of phrases they use, what kind of words and ideas they resonate with most, and mimicking that and using that in your copy and in your content. So, I mean, without identifying that first, it's impossible to write sort of a story that's really going to drive the engagement and have the reaction that you want. So, yeah, absolutely the first thing to do.
Yeah, we've had a number of episodes on here where we've talked about defining your avatar.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm a bit of a spoiler in my which one is it? One of my presentations in Barcelona. I think it's in the Scale Rentals one. I talk about throwing spaghetti against a wall,
Mm. Mhm.
and this is what a lot of us do in marketing: is you throw the spaghetti against the wall, hope something's going to stick. Meaning you're marketing out to absolutely everybody in the hope that somebody's going to come along and like it enough
Mm.
to look further. Whereas targeted marketing is very, very different.
Niching, yeah,
Yeah,
niching.
and I absolutely love that. So once again, I'm going to come back to examples. Can you share any examples of any specific brands that you know that really do this well, that do storytelling well?
So I think I'm going to lean into sort of the more unconventional examples because I think with storytelling, when it comes to short-term rental brands, I think we've seen quite a few brands sharing their own personal stories, which is great. A really interesting way. This is actually quite a recent example. We reaped the benefits of it just a couple of weeks ago. So, a brand I work with, AES Events, they offer corporate short-term rental accommodation in the south of France, and we recently started creating a lot of long form content. So AES's event, short term rental accommodation, is geared towards a very, very corporate market. So you wouldn't ordinarily think that the creative, fluffy type of storytelling would work with that particular audience. And the brief and their content marketing strategy is all about creating long form content, very much journalistics type of stuff and reports. So, what we recently did is we started sharing stories within these very long, research heavy pieces that would get these corporate clients to book with AES events when they want to visit the south of France for like the Cannes Film Festival and things like that. So the reports that we created, I mean, they're very research heavy. They sound quite, there's a lot of information in them, but to help us break them down, we used stories, mini stories of how other similar brands, similar to the ones we were targeting, were basically attending these film festivals and the events in Cannes and then booking onto, brands like AES events. And it was really cool because what we did was we created really long form sort of reports, but because we broke them down into stories, we then emailed the little mini stories to a targeted list of the brands that we were trying to attract. And off the back of that, the engagement was great from the actual target brands that we were trying to engage with. But off the back of that, we actually had Channel 5 over here get in touch with us and ask us if we would be interested in sharing some of the stories for a documentary that they would be running. And I remember when I got the email, when I got the LinkedIn message from one of the ladies in the Channel 5 studio, she said, "We really appreciated the way you've shared these corporate stories, and we would love to do sort of some mini sort of film type narratives for an upcoming documentary that will be airing at the end of the year." So this is very much an example of corporate storytelling. It's very much an example of sort of showing how storytelling is not just for things like your about page, it's not just for pretty Instagram tiles and things like that. It's very relevant for that, don't get me wrong. But even if you're trying to, even if you have more of a corporate market, even if your target demographic are more the businessy type of people, again narratives work for everyone because it's a universal, it's the universal language among all of us, right? So that is my favorite example, purely because the ROI on that was
Yeah,
huge. And I know for a fact that was because we embedded stories into the long form content that we were creating.
that's a great example. Um, yeah, that sort of brought to mind something I'm watching at the moment, and I'm sure you've come across Welcome to Wrexham.
Yeah, I've come across it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we are completely. obsessed with Welcome to Wrexham at the moment. For
Mhm.
those who haven't watched it, particularly maybe those in the US, or maybe you have seen it in the US. I don't know. It's about Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney buying Wrexham Football Club, which was a fairly lowly football club in Wales. Is it in Wales?
Wales, I think. Yeah.
It is. Wrexham is in Wales. Somebody's going to shoot me. Andy Medic. Andy Medic, I'm so sorry. Wrexham is in Wales. Um, yes, and the reason I mention it is because it is such a compelling documentary because of all the stories.
Mm,
Because, and you mentioned, just pulling in Channel 5, wanting to have some of these, use some of these stories.
mm,
And I find this documentary that we're watching so compelling because of the stories.
mm.
And this is what now and now I'm going to go back again to how can hosts and managers create these compelling stories when they aren't natural storytellers, because most of us aren't natural storytellers.
That's interesting because I think I genuinely think we are all born storytellers because we tell stories without even realizing that we do. So, somebody coming home after a long shift at Tesco, a supermarket, coming home to their wife. Honey, how was your day? What did you do? Oh, we had a customer and they were complaining at checkout, this, and that. And then somebody dropped a juice box on the floor. That's a story. We all tell stories without even having realized it. I think
I
sometimes,
think that's it. We don't actually realize that we're doing it. So yes, you're absolutely right.
yeah. So, and I think, but I understand your point because I think as soon as you say storytelling, especially to business owners, they kind of think of a long sort of narrative with the beginning, middle, and the end, like Shakespearean type stuff. But newsreaders, people in our everyday lives, your barista when you're ordering coffee with them and they're telling you about how they got a haircut, last week, we all tell stories. So I think understanding that first and foremost that is that every single one of us 100% has the ability, the natural biological ability to not only tell stories, but to appreciate them and receive them. It is the easiest thing to understand. So I would definitely start off by just having that, try understanding that realization first. In terms of actually using storytelling for your short-term rental business now, there are so many different routes you can go down, and there are so many different ways you can do it. I've recently started working with somebody in the industry who actually approached me with exactly the same question. I want to use storytelling for my short term rental brand. I have no idea where to start. So, with this person, and I think this is a great way for anyone to start, what we're doing is, again, we've split it into personal storytelling and corporate storytelling. So, we're going to start off with this person's personal story first. We are writing down their personal story, very much with the intention to use that as part of their personal brand and to help us then determine how we can use the best parts of their story and help us determine the values and the brand personality of their business, because it goes hand in hand. So that's what we're starting off with. And that will inevitably inspire lots of other ideas. And actually, it's a really great therapeutic, almost somewhat of a healing exercise when you write down your own story. So that is personally where I would start. After you've done that, it definitely becomes a lot easier to start thinking about the storytelling you can use in your business, the corporate storytelling. Start off with what it is that you want your brand to stand for. A lot of people fixate on features. I have this many properties, we have this, and this in each property, and you know, big mountains and beautiful views. And yet these are great things, but focus on the benefits. Is there a giant bed in your master bedroom? I know we're not supposed to use the term master anymore, actually, so forgive me. Or is that what you're offering? Or are you offering a good night's sleep at the end of a really long day at the office, or as some kind of escape? So it's definitely about that. So I would say definitely start with thinking about your personal story. because that will inspire ideas for your corporate storytelling. Once you start focusing on the stories you can start creating for your business, think about your guests and
Hmm.
what problems you're solving for them. But I mean, I know it sounds quite ambiguous. I think when it comes to storytelling, it's just so there is so much you can do. I always say to people that this is something that you should really think about, almost because it's not just about copywriting and content writing. A lot of what I do kind of crosses over with branding as well. It does form a large part of your brand identity and your brand personality. So it's important to bear that in mind as well. And I think it's really important to think of your brand as a story brand before you even make a start with things like your website copy, if you want to, refresh your
Hmm.
website or your blogs and things like that. So, yeah, a lot of information, a lot of ideas, I know, but that is the kind of order I would personally go in.
I just want a quick shout out, in fact, to Daniela Derin,
Mm,
who won the award at the Shorties
she's amazing.
for Skol Marbella
Yeah, School of
um,
Palm.
a, a week or so back. I mentioned Daniela because I interviewed her last week, and she talked about her marketing to bring in more digital nomads, and
Hmm.
doing it by using a simple hashtag, which was work with a view.
Yeah,
And that in itself is a
yeah.
story because it's just a few words, but it actually says so much.
Mm. Oh, that is. I heard that episode actually. I did listen. I listened to that a couple of days ago, and Daniela is amazing with, she actually, that is the perfect example, that hashtag. And actually, she's focusing on the benefits, isn't she? She's not telling
Hmm.
people that, if, you can sit here and this is what you will see, but it's about working with a view. She's reshaping how people are working, and her, again, we talked about niching earlier, didn't we? She's focusing on working nomads and almost selling a dream. I know it sounds quite, corny, but that is very much what it is, isn't it? You are selling people the dream. Who doesn't want to work with a view, especially now? It's so relevant. So yeah, Danielle is great.
Well, we did it in with our company, Cottage Link Rental Management, for years.
Mhm.
We were selling this dream of
Yeah.
leaving the city, and
Mhm.
imagine sitting on the end of a dock on a
Yes.
early in the morning as the mist rises up from the lake,
Mhm.
and you sit there and sip your coffee as you hear the sound of the loons.
Oh, beautiful.
And it was once it gets evocative like that.
Mm,
That to me is a story that sells.
mhm.
And it did. So I think anybody can do that. And we used to use the word imagine a lot at the beginning
Yeah.
of a listing. Imagine.
Mm,
Imagine sitting on the end of the dock, or imagine sitting round a campfire at night with the
yeah.
sound of the crickets and the loon. There's always a
Oh,
loon in the stories.
I love the sound of the crickets. It's so romantic. But you know what's interesting, Heather? As soon as you say that to people, you write that in a story, imagine, they will imagine. It's just,
Yeah.
it's what we do. It's actually impossible, apart from, there are very, very, very few people in the world who can't do this. Um, but it is near impossible to read something, to read a story without imagining it in your head. Have you noticed how whenever you
Mhm.
read something, you just automatically imagine yourself in that space? And that is what we want to do. That is what we're trying to do when we're using storytelling in business and just
Mhm.
in our everyday lives in general. So I love that. Sound of the
Yeah.
crickets. I really love that. Yeah.
Well, I think I remember, being taught years and years ago, using all those senses, what you can see, what you can hear, what you can taste,
Mm-hmm.
what you can feel,
Mm-hmm.
and getting all those senses in there, then you're attracting people who are perhaps more auditory or more visual or more gustatory,
Yeah.
describing not just the nice restaurant down the road, but tasting the amazing food of the region, that sort of thing. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it's great. And even actually, that. Absolutely. And again, with storytelling, it allows you to go even beyond that, because storytelling is the only kind of sort of content form that you can use where you invite people to connect with almost a higher purpose, which I know sounds quite airy fairy, but again, it's a great way of connecting your audiences to what it is that you're trying to speak
Mhm.
about, but also to your values. And, everybody, especially now in this, it's so relevant now, today's travelers, we all want to be a little bit more socially responsible. We all want to be, to do more where sustainability and things like that are concerned. And again, you can use storytelling to really drive those values forward and connect it to sort of more bigger universal truths. And it's literally limitless what you can do with it. So
I love that. I love that. Let's address the elephant in the room,
mhm.
and that's Chat GPT.
Yes, of course, let's.
Because I've heard a lot. Copywriters are done now. Everybody can do their own copy. You just got to put the right prompt into Chat GPT, and it will spit out
Mm,
what, reams of copy that you just copy and paste. Tell
mhm,
over to you.
mhm. The
Go.
robots are taking over, right? So, my talk at the Book Direct show, I feel that a lot of people have got this impression that my talk is like an anti-Chat GPT talk. I'm not anti-Chat GPT. I'm certainly not anti-AI. I'm just pro-human and pro-emotions, and that is very much what I like to lead with. So, Chat GPT, is it going to replace writers? Is it going to replace storytellers? Yeah, maybe the bad ones. Yeah, the ones who aren't,
Mhm.
aren't doing a very good job. As harsh as it sounds, that is true. Now, Chat GPT can churn out content a lot quicker than a human being. Most of the time, it's accurate. Most of the time, it's relevant. Most of the time, if you prompt it correctly, it's readable. It's okay. The one thing that completely stumps me when people talk about how useful ChatGPT is, and this is the only thing that I have a real big issue with, is when they say it can replace a human being, including like the emotional parts.
Mhm.
ChatGPT, no matter how much AI progresses over the years, no matter what happens, ChatGPT will never have a soul. Again, I know it sounds awfully romantic, but storytelling, writing is thinking. Writing is not words on a piece of paper. Writing is not me saying things to you. Writing is thinking. It's the result, it's the consequence of thinking, of feeling, of experiencing. ChatGPT cannot do that. It cannot provide context. It cannot provide substance. It cannot
Mhm.
provide the unique nuances that we love about stories so much. It cannot paint a picture in your head as well as a skilled writer can. Not any writer, but a skilled writer. So that is the most important thing to me. I mean, I think emotions and emotional marketing, the very core purpose of storytelling, that is the only thing that that only humans can do. And to me, it's as straightforward as that. Chat GPT will never have the ability to do that. It can replicate it, and you can prompt it to use more adjectives and more emotional phrases and terms, but it will never provide context in the same way. And also, there's also the other side of it that, wouldn't you want to read something that's been created by human? I know I would. Maybe not everybody would, but I think there are
Mhm.
definitely people who would much rather read something that's been created by, as a result of the feelings, the emotions, and the experiences of a human being. I think it will turn into a luxury, unfortunately. That is the way we're going, but it can never be
Mhm.
replaced. Those are my very, very strong thoughts about ChatGPT replacing writers.
Well, I use it extensively right now. I churned out 4,000 words the
Mhm,
other day
mhm,
for a very lengthy guide I'm writing. It's
mm,
now 6,000 because it's got 2,000 additional words of
mm.
mine, and they're all
Yeah,
stories.
yeah,
So it
there you
might have a few checklists in there that, okay, do me a checklist on kitchen equipment, which
yeah,
is great, So
yeah,
I've got this nice list of
that is
family
great.
friendly amenities.
Yeah,
And, but I feel that you can't just do that because it's so recognizable
Mm,
as AI, and I don't think we'll ever get away from that. That
mm,
it is. I mean, certainly to me, I can recognize AI written material,
yeah, yeah.
and I could not do that without interspersing with my tone and the way. I mean, I've been writing for years, and I love to write, and I have a very specific very specific way of doing it. It's a bit like, it's like what I'm doing now on the podcast, but it's in the written form. Couldn't do without that. So thank you for your take on it. I completely agree with everything that
Yeah,
that you offered there.
it's great for, like listings and FAQs, if you want to save time. It definitely has its uses, but like you said, where the story stuff is concerned, and I'm very much like you, I think you can tell. At the moment it might change, but you can tell when a story has been written using AI. We call it syllable patterns, don't we? So when people have used ChatGPT to create something, their content will have that very familiar tone of da 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 da, and I can hear it when I read the content. It's like it's very obvious that they've not.
And then they forget to take regenerate off the bottom.
Oh gosh, oh my goodness, you have one job. Can you imagine?
We're coming up on our time now, and I'm so enjoying this conversation, and I don't want to finish it without talking about derailed. And I want you to explain to the audience what derailed is, because it's something that I heard you and John Stokinger and Matteo
Okay.
talk about at the Book Direct show in Miami.
Mhm.
So, how is it going? What is it, and how's it going?
Thank you very much, actually, for asking about it. I appreciate that very very much. It's a project that is exceptionally close to our hearts. So, Derailed is the short term industry's very first episodic fiction murder mystery podcast, and it is a phenomenal example of how you can use storytelling as a way of creatively marketing your short term rental brand. So, John and Matteo of the No BS Short Term Rental podcast, they are absolute legends. Please do have a listen to their podcast as well as this amazing one. They are great, great, great guys, super creative. So, they approached me about a year ago and they said, Neely, we want to create this murder mystery story and we want to wrap the story around vacation rental brands. Can you help us? And I thought, as soon as I heard the idea, I thought it was a wonderful, such a great idea. So we have written a fiction story. It's completely fiction, and it's set across 13 episodes. It's within the murder mystery genre, so it's a pretty dark genre, but it's also a very, very interesting genre. The story is completely fiction, but we have embedded real life vacation rental brands such as Cassiola, Mount, Boostly. I'm not going to name all of them, try and name all of them because I might forget them, but a huge shout out to all of our sponsors. We've embedded them into the story. Now, what this does is and this is something that I would love to see more of in our industry. It's a big part of what I do, but I feel like we just don't see it enough because it's new and it's difficult. What this does is that it gives people a fiction story to enjoy and to really get their teeth into. Because it's a fiction story, we can let our imagination run completely wild. However, we can create plot holes and weave real life vacation rental brands into our fiction world. And I always say to people, when it comes to storytelling, that bit between real life and fiction, that's the most exciting part. And that is where Derailed
Mhm.
sits. So throughout the story, there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. It's a great story. Please do listen to it. Throughout the story, we have created plot holes where we weave brands, the vacation rental brands into it. And then we get the characters to speak about the benefits of the brand as if their target guests and consumers would in everyday conversation, which takes away the pitchiness, which takes away the whole salesy vibe. It's very, very difficult to do. it's probably the most difficult, creatively challenging project that I've ever worked on. Matteo and John have been, they are so amazing. The production's been amazing. Everybody on the team has been just amazing. But I think this is the ultimate and the most creative way of using storytelling to market vacation rental brands. So it's episodic. You do need to listen to it from episode 1 to follow through with the story. And we're on episode 7. So episode 7 comes out next week. And
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to put, there will be a link to Derailed, the podcast, on the show notes. I'm downloading all the episodes, and that will be in my ear all the way across the Atlantic when I head to Berlin and Barcelona. So that's a commitment. So when we meet in Barcelona, you can ask me questions.
I can ask you who done it. Who do you think did it?
Yes,
yeah. Looking forward.
Yeah. So looking forward to that. But I love the initiative. It's not the first one, not the first great initiative that's come from John and Matteo, and I'm sure it won't be the last. But I think this is one that everybody should be listening to. So if you're listening to this podcast, if you listen to the No BS podcast, then you probably know about it. If you don't, go to that one as well. There's you mentioned earlier on, Neely, there's a lot of podcasts in this space. There's hundreds of them. I'm glad to say I was out there in the very first 2 to hit the space way back in 2013.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that. That's amazing.
But be selective when you're looking for your podcasts. There's some extremely good ones. There's some that maybe are not, let's say, not as polished. And I'll leave that. I'm probably talking too much. Probably edit this out, actually.
No, don't edit this out. This is very relevant, and
but it is relevant. Neely, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I think we could go on, but we'll sit down over a coffee in Barcelona, I'm sure. And yes, and continue where we leave off here. I've loved this conversation. I'm sure my audience is loving this conversation too. I'd like to hear from you, my listeners, about your stories. Email me at heather@vacationrentalformula.com and tell me where I can find your stories on your sites or on your social media platforms, and I'll share them with Neely.
That would be amazing.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
See you in Barcelona.